Chapter 7 is really long, and I think the focus is more likely to be with the electrolytes, and those are the ones that I recommend that you pay the greatest attention to. Minerals are inorganic, meaning that they don't contain carbon in their structure. However, they are essential. They have no calories at all, and unlike vitamins, or I should say, yes, unlike vitamins, they're better able to maintain their structure by cooking or by digestion, so they're not degraded or broken down. This is a great picture about the function of minerals, and so here we have the same list of options in terms of energy production, nervous system, blood, bone, antioxidant, and so forth. And you'll see that there is a greater variety of functions of the minerals. So minerals, if you look at calcium, nervous system, blood, bone, and muscle function. It's spread across to more functions, with the exception of looking at sulfur, fluoride, iodine, molybdenum, selenium, a much smaller range of actions. If a small amount is needed, less than 100 milligrams, it's a trace mineral. If it's needed in greater amounts, it's a major mineral. And you're probably well aware of sodium, calcium, those we need more of, iron, zinc, and chromium, smaller needs. Calcium is the first one, and it is the one that we have in most abundance in our requirements and also in our body. And calcium has many roles, as I mentioned in that graph. Clotting of blood, muscle contraction, bone formation, obviously calcium is necessary for that, and we have a greatest need. So you'll see that we have 1,000 milligrams up to age, when we look at athletes 19 to 50, and the increase goes up in females, in menopausal, premenopausal, postmenopausal, and males at the age of 70. Foods that are very high in calcium would be our soy, our calcium processed tofu, dairy products. I think it's interesting, sesame seeds are also in there, and sardines, canned sardines, particularly because those are not deboned, so it's the bone component. When we get into good sources, we can look at sources that vegetarians might be more likely to consume, or vegans. So we have molasses, we have our soybeans, spinach, turnip greens, and fortified cereals. Calcium has deficiencies that are going to be more evident to you. Although it's rare to have low calcium, it can be found in individuals that are not consuming a good source. And the low bone density is going to be the biggest issue, perhaps muscle spasms as well. And the low bone density is going to be leading for an athlete to get a higher risk of a fracture, whether it's a stress fracture or it's a full fracture. We're also going to be at risk as not having enough bone bank, and have more of a risk of osteoporosis or osteopenia. Those are going to be in our athletes that are not consuming sufficient calories, not consuming enough calcium, or low calcium foods, not being really not taking enough care to make sure that they're getting fortified foods. The toxicity, on the other hand, would be most likely kidney stones, and the kidney stones are going to be quite painful. The supplements should be taken no more than 500 milligrams at a time, because it's not absorbed. It's better to be absorbed. It's better to take with a little bit of food and not to take it with a lot of other supplements at the same time. So not like your morning consumption. This is calcium oxalate stones. It's really the toxicity component. If somebody's got dehydration or they have high sodium, high protein intake, the calcium oxalate stones are going to be the most likely. And notice that kidney stones, most of them are calcium oxalate, 60 to 80% of them. Now when calcium levels are low, as you see at the top, and you have a stimulation of the parathyroid gland, which are those 4 small dots that are on the posterior part of your thyroid, which is right about your neck. That parathyroid gland is going to stimulate bone. Really, it broadcasts parathyroid hormone, broadcasts to the bone for osteoclasts to kind of chew up the bone and release the calcium. That's going to provide calcium release into the bloodstream. The parathyroid gland also broadcasts to the kidney to convert vitamin D in its inactive form to calcitriol. It then goes to the gut for greater absorption of calcium. So the parathyroid hormone with low calcium, the kidneys are going to release or activate vitamin D for greater absorption in the gut. It's also going to reabsorb it in the kidneys. It's going to cause greater reabsorption. That's going to increase calcium in the gut. It's going to result in increased calcium absorption, and with a bone, it's going to have greater release of calcium. So the parathyroid hormone is important for raising blood calcium. So who's at risk for calcium deficiency? Well, you've got individuals that are postmenopausal, that's why you have the increased need. Individuals that avoid calcium foods, perhaps they're lactose intolerant and they're not conscientious of getting the calcium supplementation. If they avoid dairy for a variety of reasons, that perhaps they think it's mucus production, or they think that it's a high calorie food. If they just plain have a poor diet, individuals that have gut inflammation or intestinal inflammation, these are individuals with a history of GI disorders or gluten intolerance, they're at a greater risk for deficiency. It's really needed during rapid growth periods, and so young athletes especially are going to be needing it, and then during the growth period at puberty. Certain medications, if you have too many over-the-counter antacids or stomach acid reduction, an individual who's on steroids or blood pressure medications can have an increased need. Drinking too much caffeine, whether it's tea, caffeinated drinks, caffeine water, that actually increases calcium excretion. If you're not getting enough sunshine or vitamin D or magnesium deficiency, you have a risk of being deficient. And drinking too much too much soda actually robs your bones of calcium as well. So those are some examples of who's at risk for calcium deficiency. Phosphorus is important because it's the backbone of DNA. It's important for ATP. It's part of ATP, so it's going to be important for energy, enzyme activity, cell membrane formation. It's critical. We look at places where we're going to get our phosphorus. cheese, milk, herring, ground beef. And so here we're looking at good sources. Almonds, cooked black beans, peanut butter can give us good sources. Lentils can give us good sources of phosphorus as well. The deficiency is going to be associated with bone malformation. It's involved with bones, muscle weakness. If you get too much phosphorus, it's going to be sucking the calcium out of the bones, and it's going to be involved with osteoporosis. Are supplements needed? Highly unlikely. If we return back to the relationship between phosphorus and calcium, when calcium is low, phosphorus is high. They usually are related that way. When they are elevated, when phosphorus is elevated, there is a decrease in, there's a feedback to the parathyroid hormone. And you'll have, that's where when you get those drinks that's a lot of soda that phosphates or phosphorus, it will communicate with the parathyroid hormone to decrease production. And when calcium is low, we want to have release it from the bones, and we want to absorb it in the gut, and we want to reabsorb it in the kidney. Well, elevated phosphorus actually is negative feedback for that action to happen. In the bones, both osteoblasts and clasts release a growth factor, a fibroblast growth factor, which is identified as FGF23. If you follow the dotted line, you have negative feedback to the parathyroid hormone, so you have decreased parathyroid production. You also have, follow the second dotted line, you have a decreased conversion of inactive vitamin D to calcitriol, which is the activated form of vitamin D, which is required for gut absorption of calcium. So the problem is elevated phosphorus alters the calcium absorption. So you have less calcium absorption and altered bone resorption. So it's really problematic. So that's why we don't want to have a lot of sodium and why we don't want to have a lot of phosphorus. I said sodium, I meant, sorry about that. We don't want to have a lot of phosphorus because it decreases our calcium absorption. Magnesium is primarily important for enzymatic activity. It's been shown to decrease muscle cramps at night and potentially decrease blood pressure. It's also involved with bone formation. We have magnesium foods, sesame seeds, almonds, cooked fish, such as halibut. We also have good source of magnesium in, let's see here, cashews, raw spinach, yogurt, whole wheat bread. We get some good amounts there. And we look at the 400 milligrams to 420 milligrams. It's a pretty small RDA for women, 310 to 320. We end up having a pretty good source of magnesium coming from our grains, vegetables, and our legumes. And that means that really we have not a very difficult time getting our recommended daily amount. Deficiency is going to be muscle cramps, hypertension, headaches. It can be because someone's got insufficient intake or over excretion. Supplementation is going to be needed for those that have deficiencies. Sometimes magnesium is used when individuals have cramping of their legs at night or restless leg syndrome. It can kind of help settle down the irritability that an individual will experience. Supplementation only for individuals that have the symptoms of not enough. Sodium is a major mineral. It is an electrolyte. It's involved in muscle contraction, regulation of blood pressure, and the adequate intake is 1,500 milligrams, which we as Americans have no problem getting it. It's important. If you cook your own foods, you have control of how much sodium that you're consuming. If you cook produced foods or foods that are processed, highly processed, sodium is used as a stabilizer, and so it's usually high in a number of processed foods. So the sodium that we consume in our diet, we lose some in our feces or sweat, we lose some in our cells, we use it in extracellular fluid, some bones, and then we lose it in urine. We really don't need to have sodium added. We pretty much get enough if we salt our food, not a problem there. The deficiency is known as hyponatremia. Now, deficiency is typically not an issue unless you have activities, strenuous activities lasting longer than 4 hours. So triathletes, Ironmen, the supplementation will be in order, and the problem occurs if somebody does not consume, if they consume too much plain water and not a sports drink. Our electrolytes in the sports drinks for activities that last for a long duration, high intensity, we need to consume those. If you look at the sodium content in foods, pickles have a tremendous amount of sodium. So here you can have individuals drinking a little pickle juice to help with getting that sodium. Cured ham, obviously it's cured with sodium. We have spaghetti sauce, biscuits, potato chips, American cheese all have a high content of sodium. So typically we don't need to have a supplement, but if we have a long endurance activity, marathons, you need to have some supplementation during that activity. Here is an example of activities that are marathons, hiking, canoeing, long duration, high intensity in hot climates. When you have a volume depletion and high sweat rates, there is a potential for having difficulties with sodium. Here we have hot weather, ultracycling Ironman. We end up having a need for it. So when we're looking at the ultra endurance later on in the book, we're going to look at this a little bit more closely. Chloride is also a major electrolyte. It's involved in fluid balance, digestion. A person may lose chloride if they do excessive vomiting with loss of that HCl, diarrhea, excessive sweating, corticosteroids. It very unlikely, but we have abnormal heart rhythm, poor blood flow. Are supplements needed? It appears to be really no benefit of supplementation at this time. Potassium is a major electrolyte. It's involved for nervous transmission, muscle contraction, blood pressure. We have potassium and sodium are regulated. They're on opposite sides of the cell. We have an adequate intake, which is relatively easy to have. It's primarily found inside the cell, where sodium is found on the outside of the cell. We have the regulation of the two with the sodium-potassium pump, And really, if sodium levels are high, a way to help to lower that sodium is to eat high potassium foods because of the sodium-potassium relationship. Foods that are good sources are going to be bananas, but look at a potato. If you eat the skin of the potato especially, it has a really nice source of potassium. We have baked beans on there, cantaloupe, fresh apricots, raw spinach. So we have sources that are available for all individuals, whether they eat fish or not, or if they eat animal products with milk, for example. Deficiencies are going to be cramping, muscle weakness, heart arrhythmias. Toxicity is extremely rare, and supplements typically are not needed. Wanted to point out that the main functions of these electrolytes, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, calcium, and potassium, are all involved with pH of the blood, electrical transmission, muscle contraction, nervous impulse, and fluid maintenance. So our electrolytes are your key blood volume, fluid volume. That's one of their main components. On the left-hand side, I have the relationship of when blood potassium is elevated or sodium is low. The hormone aldosterone is released from the adrenal cortex. It sits right on top of your kidney. It communicates with the kidney to reabsorb sodium and push calcium out, and that helps to regulate. That's a primary regulator of our sodium potassium levels.